This entire conversation appears to be revolving around a relationship with Israel. After Israel, the United States donates more money to Egypt than any other country, and we're also talking about Egypt. When talking about Israel's decisions about how to relate to its neighbors, you're talking about the demographic problem, and you were talking about the blockade of the wall, and also our blockade of the Gaza Strip. However, the blockade of the Gaza Strip is impossible without Egypt's help. And I believe that's why we give money to Egypt, and that's why we back Mubarak, to protect Israel and to allow them to defend their demographic situation. My question is, what is it that's compelling us to do such acts for Israel? Like, what is it that we're so interested in? Is it about the oil?
What's the source of U.S. support? You're perfectly right. I mean,
one of the reasons the U.S. and Israel were upset about the threat to Mubarak was that he was cooperating in the strangulation of the Gaza Strip. That's only one part of it. His agreement, there was a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979. There's a long history of that, but the effect of the treaty was understood right away. It freed Israel up to carry out aggressive actions elsewhere. So you read Israeli strategic analysts, say Avner Yaniv, right in 1980. They said, okay, now Israel's free. We don't have any threat from Egypt, so therefore we're free to attack Lebanon, say, which they did. Right after that was their big invasion of Lebanon, and it's sort of been kept that way. So, if Egypt did have a democratic uprising, succeeded, almost certainly that arrangement wouldn't remain, or at least would reduce in character, and then Israel would be forced to deploy forces in the southern region and so on. So why is the U.S. supporting Israel? Well, that's a very interesting question. And if you look closely, you can find reasons. So just ask yourself for a minute, where is the strongest support coming from? So take, say, the press. I mean, the most rabid pro-Israel newspaper is the Wall Street Journal. Now, the Wall Street Journal is not part of the lobby. It's the newspaper of the business world. The Republicans are far more extreme in support of Israeli expansion and atrocities than the Democrats. Jewish votes and Jewish money tend to go to the Democrats. But again, the Republicans are the business party. I mean, they're so deep in the pockets of corporate America, you need a telescope to find them. That's what they are. And so they're strongly supportive of Israel. If you look at the business community at large, you see pretty much the same thing. They think Israel's fine. So U.S. investment in high-tech industry in Israel keeps going up. Intel, major chip producer in the world, has a new generation of chips coming out that they say they think will take over the world market. Now, their main factory they're building right now is in Israel. They have a military industry. For them, Israel's a bonanza. So say take Lockheed Martin. When the United States essentially gives Israel the F-35s, that's a huge boost for Lockheed Martin. But remember, it's a double boost, because when the U.S. gives arms to Israel, that's what's called in retail marketing a teaser. What it means is that Saudi Arabia, which has all the money, they're going to come along and say, we want something like that too. And then the U.S. can send second-rate arms, which they can't use anyway, to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And in fact, Obama just made it's $3 billion to Israel, but he just made a $60 billion deal with Saudi Arabia. Well, that's for a long time been the way in which the U.S., and to a lesser degree Britain, recycle petrodollars, keep military industry functioning, and so on. So they love it. And they're a big lobby, they're very powerful. U.S. military and intelligence have had pretty close relations with Israel since the 50s and maintain them. Apart from all these kind of concrete bases of support, there are kind of cultural issues which I don't think should be dismissed. So the U.S., I don't have to tell you, is an unusually religious country. It's kind of off the spectrum, international spectrum in religious belief. And it's not just evangelicals, that's elites. It's elites too. And in fact, Christian Zionism, both in Britain and the United States, goes back way before Jewish Zionism. It goes back to the 19th century, before the Jewish Zionist movement even took off. And it's quite real. So, for example, during the First World War, when British General Allenby conquered Jerusalem from the Turks, you just take a look at the headlines in the mainstream U.S. and British press. General Allenby was Richard the Lionhearted, literally, rescuing the Holy Land from the infidels. In other words, he was winning the War of the Crusades, finally. Huge cheers, Well, the next thing, after we get the Holy Land back from the infidels, is you have to follow the words of the Bible. Well, the Lord, to be precise, the war god, that's who the Lord of the Old Testament is, the war god promised the land of Israel to the Jews. So we got to bring the Jews back. That's fulfilling God's will. You go on to say the Roosevelt administration, secular administration, but one of Roosevelt's main advisors, Harold Ickes, who's secular, of course, said that the return of Jews to Palestine then is I think the greatest achievement in human history. He said something like that. And this goes all the way to the present. It's an extremely religious country. It extends over much of the population. People like Woodrow Wilson and Harry Truman, they're reading the Bible every day. And the Bible tells you things, like it tells you it's our holy land, doesn't belong to the infidels, they don't belong there, and the Jews have to go back. And then if you go way off to the Christian right, and you get into the revivalist movement, okay, then there's more things happening. Like that movement actually really took off in 1948. The Jews were back in Palestine. You go to now Israel. You go to the Book of Revelations. It goes on until you have Armageddon, and everybody slaughters each other, which is wonderful because the souls that are saved rise to heaven, including, incidentally, 144,000 Jews for some reason. But the rest are eternal damnation. So we've got to press this. And, this, again, is not, strange preachers in Texas. Now, this is right in the White House. So, for example, take, say, George W. Bush. Well, it hasn't been discussed much, but when Bush was trying to get international support for the invasion of Iraq, we're now talking about January 2003, he met with the president of France, Chirac, and we sort of have the documents from the French side, but Bush apparently started ranting about some extremely obscure passage in the book of Ezekiel. It's about Gog and Magog, and nobody knows what it means. I mean, are they people, are they places, whatever it is. But according to this passage, Gog and Magog that come down and, destroy Israel, and then comes Armageddon and all kind of things. Chirac had no idea what he was talking about. So he asked the French Foreign Office, the Élysée, if they could explain to him what this maniac is raving about. And they didn't know. So they contacted a Belgian theologian. Actually, that's how I found out about it. The Belgian theologian sent me a copy of a disquisition that he wrote to the French Foreign Office, explaining the interpretations of this obscure passage and its role in, Christian right, fantasies. This isn't the White House. I mean, that stuff is not insignificant. And there are other things, too. The United States, remember, is a settler colonial society. The whole so-called Anglosphere, the expansion of England, is settler colonial imperialism. The United States, Canada, Australia. Now, that's the most vicious form of imperialism because it means wiping out the indigenous population. The French sort of was the same in Algeria, but most imperialism wasn't that way. It's the Anglosphere, which is typically settler colonial. And that's deep in our history. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I was a little kid, we were playing cowboys and Indians, and we were the cowboys killing the Indians. I think it's a little better these days, but this is really deep in the culture. It's a settler colonial society. We belong here, they don't. They were, all kinds of stories about how they didn't really have any right to the land, and should be. It's right through the most elite literature. It's not crazy stuff, and that's just part of general consciousness. And you take a look at Israel, that's what it is, a settler colonial society. It's an advanced culture of Europeans coming into this land, eliminating the barbarians who don't belong there in the first place. And there's a kind of a natural sympathy that develops. I mean, I think all of these are factors that shouldn't be ignored. How deep they are is another question, but you could have said the same with South Africa. In fact, it was true in South Africa. There was a very natural association. South Africa is another settler colonial society. And there's a natural kind of sympathy in white America with white nationalist racism. It was real, and nevertheless, the U.S. did change policy.
You kind of just started talking about the comparison to South Africa. In the beginning of your speech, you said that the comparisons are often questionable, and I was wondering if you could explain which ones are questionable and why.
I really don't think it's a very good comparison. First of all, in the case of Israel, there's two questions. One is Israel itself, and secondly, the occupied territories. Israel itself is a discriminatory society. And there's plenty of discriminatory laws, and I've been writing about them for years, but it's nothing like apartheid. In fact, it's more like the United States has been through much of its history and still to some extent is. So it's bad, and it should be overcome, and there are things to say about it, but it's not apartheid. On the other hand, when you get to the occupied territories, it's much worse than apartheid, much worse. Just remember, white South Africa needed the black population. They were its workforce. Just like the slave states in the South needed the black population. That's the workforce. Can't get rid of them. And if you go back to the Civil War, it's worth reading the debates. They're not. The slave owners had arguments. They thought they were right, and they justified their position. And they had arguments, some of which were never really answered. So, for example. To be anachronistic, if I own a car and you rent the same car and we come back a year later, which one's going to be in better shape? Well, mine will. Since I own it, I'll take care of it. Now, you don't own it, so if it gets dented or something happens, you won't do anything. Well, that's the slave owner's argument. We own our workforce. You rent them. So we take care of our workforce. You don't. You can just toss them out it's called wage labor. You rent them. You don't want them anymore, you toss them out. You have no responsibility for them. So we're the ones who are moral and you're immoral. Well, you might think about whether there's an answer to that. Anyhow, that was essentially the South African white stand. We take care of the Bantustans because we need them. And in fact, to some extent they did. There was some development in the Bantustans. Partly for this reason, partly because they were trying to make them enough of a showcase so that the world would recognize them. On the other hand, Israel has absolutely no need or interest in the domestic population in the West Bank. They're perfectly happy to get rid of them all. There's the nuisance, So they don't take care of them, they don't support them. I mean, they're just a nuisance, get rid of them. I mean, they used to use them as a workforce years ago, but that ended quite a while ago. Partly because it ended because of the success of what's called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the set of policies that the U.S. and its allies imposed on much of the world through the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization and so on. They're very highly regarded. If you're taking economics courses, they'll tell you how wonderful it is. But in fact, it devastated the societies, and it left a huge number of people in total misery. One of the reasons why there's so much immigration from Mexico, there are others, but that's one. As this plague spread around the world, Israel was able to get very cheap labor from Thailand, Latin America, Romania, Actually, their favorites were from China. There wasn't neoliberalism there, but the favorites, they were called slave labor, which is virtually what they were, contract labor. They take away their passports, they're under the control of the contractor who brings them in. The beauty of China was that Chinese labor was that if they ever protested, so like maybe they wanted their wages paid or something, you could just call in the Chinese embassy, and the Chinese embassy would lay down the law. You say, you shut up, or we're going to send you back to China, and you know what's going to happen to you there. So that was a nice arrangement. But as long as they have that cheap semi-slave workforce, they don't need Palestinians anymore. If they had Palestinians, they more or less have to take care of them. In any event, in the occupied territories, I think it's a lot worse than apartheid. There was nothing in the Bantustans that's treated, say, like Gaza or even the West Bank. So in two respects, I don't think it's a valid analogy. But there is a valid analogy, I think, namely the one I mentioned. That's almost never discussed because there's one taboo topic in the United States and in the West generally, namely actual power. The actual power of the United States and its allies and the way they run the world, it's kind of taboo. You're not supposed to talk about that. So that's sort of excluded, although it's the core issue, or maybe because it's the core issue.
We're going to take two more.
Thank you. In the last 30 years that I've been involved in this issue, I've seen an enormous increase in public awareness on this question. More op-eds printed, more letters to the editor, even a growth of awareness within the American Jewish community, just incredibly different. 30 years ago, Norman Finkelstein and I spoke here, and we were shouted down. And it's just an incredible difference between, this evening. But nonetheless, even though that has happened, many people here have been to the West Bank and Gaza and so on, Congress, no matter what Israel does, invade Lebanon, invade Gaza, build settlements which humiliate our diplomats and so on, and statements like this, whenever Israel does something outrageous, they have a resolution that comes forward and everyone votes for it, including our own representative, who's a great guy on all kinds of social issues. And I've met with him and brought him information and whatever. What can we do to reverse this so that somebody like Deval Patrick, for instance, would even have a clue that making a business arrangement, which he just did with Israel, has some moral overtones and political overtones? Nobody would have done that in the 80s with South Africa. They would have known that there was a political cost, or they might have known there was a political cost. What can we do to help that? Because despite the public opinion, members of Congress are overwhelmingly voting, unquestionably for Israel.
Yeah. Well, what you say is absolutely right. I mean,
I've been doing this since the 60s. Not very long ago, I'd have to have police protection. I was giving a talk. And yes, meetings were broken up, and just even a couple of years ago. So yeah, that's changed enormously. But the comparison to South Africa in the 80s is not quite accurate because, by the 80s, even U.S. business was opposed to apartheid. Okay, that Congress was passing resolutions and so on. You compare it to the 60s or the 50s, it's more like the case of Israel. There's a lot of public opposition too. racism, but nothing in public policy. It took a lot of work. There was a lot of organizing, activism, education, and it made a breakthrough. So the first sanctions proposal at a university, at least, as I recall, I think was as late as 1977 at Hampshire, kind of a university that's kind of on the outside. And that was after a long time. And by then, even American corporations were starting to pull out. So, and in fact, what you describe here with regard to the gap, first of all, don't forget, we're not a majority. I mean, you're right that there's a big change, but that's a long way from saying, we speak for the people, It's the Maoist slogans. Got a long way to go. But it's a big change. But you just think about American politics. I mean, even where the public is overwhelmingly in favor of something, it almost never affects policy if it harms business interests. Okay, so take, say, healthcare, big issue. I mean, right now we're all supposed to, be worried about how to cut the deficit. And a pretty straightforward way to get rid of the deficit. And any economists who look at this are fully aware of it. You want to get rid of the deficit, establish a healthcare system like other industrial countries. Now, that's not exactly a utopian goal. Every other industrial country has national healthcare systems which have about half the per capita cost of the United States and generally have better outcomes. And don't have tens of thousands of people without insurance. So in fact, I can refer you to the sources if you want, but it's been worked out. If we had the same kind of healthcare system as other industrial countries, we would not only not have a deficit, we'd have a surplus. Is anybody suggesting that? I mean, it sounds insane. How can you oppose the insurance companies and the financial corporations? I mean, they're the guys who fund elections. They're the ones who put Obama into office. That's maybe a third of corporate profits. You can't offend them. Doesn't matter what the public wants.